In our last podcast, we ended with you kind of just talking a little bit about what happened in Kursk. I figured we can pick up there.
Sure.
So maybe you can just let's start from the beginning. What's going on? What is this incursion? Why did Ukraine invade Kursk, go into Kursk? What was their objective? Is there a military objective, or what was the point of this?
Uh-huh. Okay, well, that's a rather difficult question to answer. We can't be completely sure. There's some possibilities. One, maybe they were trying to simply divert forces from the Donbass, where they're losing badly in a couple of places, namely, Toretsk and the area to the west of Cheterino. So that's one possibility. They're trying to divert Russian forces. Anyway, that's a theory that's been put forward. Another is, I think, probably the most likely one, that it's mainly a PR stunt. Or let's just say that's the second theory that's been forward. That the focus has been shifted to the Middle East. Nobody's paying attention to them. They've dropped from the news. And, Zelensky and his regime, they're real publicity hogs. He feels like that he has to constantly show something. He has to, so that Europe doesn't forget about him. They continue to believe in him. That will keep on sending him more weapons and money. Okay, that's another possibility, right? And then the third is actually something that the regime itself, at least one of the officials, stated. It says the intent was to sow panic, sow fear among Russian citizens. And this has been used as justification for various, attacks actually on civilian targets in Russia in the past. And actually, if you look at what they've done, I think that that's probably the main objective, because they this time they went in with a much larger force than they have in the past. Last year, I think it was in April and May, they had it was the Russian Volunteer Force, another one of these Russian neo-Nazi groups, right, made incursions into the Belgorod region. But these were small. They weren't actually very well planned. This was large. At least a couple thousand men are involved in this, and it seems to have been very well planned. There are rumors that MI6 was involved in the planning. Anyway, they went in with much more force, and it was preceded by an artillery barrage and a massive drone attack. So they've moved in and seized some of the settlements right on the other side of the border, but they also sent some smaller detachments farther in, and into the rear, deeper into Russian territory, like 5-10 kilometers. And these are not units large enough to actually seize and hold territory, but they did create a lot of confusion and some real panic. So if you're watching the Russian Telegram channels, there was, you're getting these reports like, they're 10-15 kilometers in. There's some people that were just thinking, we're losing it. This is like like the Kharkov offensive of 2022 all over again. But as this progresses, it becomes clear that that these were actually, again, very small units, and they did succeed in the objective of creating a lot of fear and confusion. And they also did disrupt, for example, evacuation efforts. And then if you look at the targets, a lot of these, they've been actually attacking civilian targets again. There was an ambulance that was struck, and the driver and a paramedic was killed. The doctor was severely injured. There was an old woman, I believe, above 70 years of age, who was deliberately killed. Maybe they didn't know she was in the apartment, but you can see the FPV drone go in through the window in a civilian residential apartment building, and she was killed. There are scenes you can see of them just shooting at random civilian cars that are trying to evacuate. And that all indicates that this essentially, or at least in part, is a terrorist attack. When you say your intention is to sow fear, that's terrorism, right? That's kind of and you do it through violence. That's actually a textbook definition of terrorism. So there is that, but they've also gone in with more forces close to the border and have seized some territory, not very deep, but some of those, as I understand it, some of the settlements very close to the border. So I would say that it's a combination of what they're doing is again, it's this idea of trying to, create, to humiliate Putin, to make the Russian government, look weak, to sow fear within the population. The idea is somehow that, that's going to cause the Russians to turn on their government. And this is an idea that you hear from them again and again, but it's never worked. It always has the opposite of the intended effect. I mean, the result is always that the Russians are furious after these incidents. They see the attack on the ambulance, they see the civilians being killed in their cars, and they just resolve to say, okay, we got to march on Kiev. We just got to get rid of these bastards. And I think that's the reaction.
Right.
But on the
I mean,
the other hand, go ahead.
I was going to say, something like this is going to be more effective than any recruitment ad that Russia can put out. If they see their ambulances getting shot up and these acts of terrorism being committed on their own country, it's going to make people be more resolved to defeat
Right.
the Kiev regime.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to, like you said, it's a idiotic policy. If their idea was really, like you said, to sow fear into the Russian public, then this is terrorism. And you said that MI6 was involved in this. Was the CIA as well? Is the
there are
CIA
rumors.
MI6?
Right. There are rumors that MI6 is involved. We don't know. We'll probably never know for sure.
I mean, anything that Ukraine does, surely the U.S. and intelligence knows about it, right? So
Yeah.
do you think this was okayed by U.S. intelligence that, okay, we'll go for this terrorist activity? Was there any, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Was there any military objective or military assets that they were targeting, or was it purely, striking civilian infrastructure?
Yeah,
And
exactly. Well, that's okay. Yeah, no, there isn't any military infrastructure there. And that's actually something that some, Kiev regime supporters have pointed out very angrily. People like Julian Rebke, the German who writes for Bild, a German magazine. There's another Finnish analyst, a Ukrainian analyst, all these people. They're saying, like, what the hell are you doing speaking to the Ukrainians? There's nothing there of military value. You're losing in Donbass, and that's the battle that matters, right? So what are you doing? It's a waste. It's going to be, no matter what, it's going to be very costly for them because offense is always more costly than defense in this war, in any war, really. And, when you go on offense without without air superiority, quite the reverse, you don't have anybody covering you from the air, and your artillery is, far weaker than the enemy's. Well, you're exposed. I mean, and according to the Ministry of Defense, they've already lost 1,000 soldiers. I think that's just not surprising. This is bound to be extremely costly for them. And these are people that could have been sent down to the Donbass. So that first theory that I mentioned, that this is a diversion, just doesn't make sense to me. Because if you're worried about the Donbass, just send them directly to the Donbass. Why go engage in this stunt here?
well, also Russia has hundreds of thousands of people in reserve to plug any hole they wanted to, even if they have to. They're not stretched thin at all.
Right. That's
The Russian army is larger than it's ever been.
Right.
So yeah,
So,
that doesn't make any
yeah,
sense. So I think that theory is out the window.
I agree. That's also true.
Right.
So what's happening is, the reserves are coming in, and initially it was a very lightly defended border. Now, part of the problem was, and then part of the reason that it was easy a big part of the reason it was easy for the Ukrainians to cross there, is that actually that section of the border, according to my understanding, was demined fairly recently. Because, as we've spoken of earlier, the Russians were probably intending to strike into it's the Sumy region. They're on the other side of the border in Ukraine. There were a lot of rumors that an offensive was being prepared by the Russians, and they were going to go into Sumy. And one of the reasons that people believe they were is that they were removing the mines from the minefields there. So they had, and it looks like they were getting ready to do it, but the Ukrainians, you have to say, give them credit, cleverly up to a point, at a tactical short-term level, took advantage of that and struck. It was very lightly defended right there. There were simply border guards. There weren't very many personnel. Now the reserves weren't too far away, but it takes a little bit of time. They can't keep too close to the border. You can't because they can always be struck by enemy artillery and rockets. But they're now, and more are coming in, and I think inevitably the attack will be repelled. It might. The ones that have dug in close to the border, it may take a couple weeks. You know how it is when people they dig into the trenches or occupy the basements in a village. It can be a bloody fight. It can take a while, but they'll push them out. I don't think there's any question about it, and they won't have to divert any forces. It would be, on a very in the short term, you could say they achieved their objective. They did create a certain amount of panic. You could see it on the Telegram channel. I was reading at all these reports, and you were getting. I've never seen such a confusion, so many conflicting reports. There's one side that was saying, "Okay, hey, not much is happening here," and then, well, I shouldn't say one side, but some some people and groups were reporting this, and then others were saying, "Man, they're marching and they're 15 kilometers deep, they're 20 kilometers deep. It's done. What's happening here? We're going to lose." And because again, through by sending in these small detachments and fairly deep into the territory, they could create the impression that there was more going on than really was going on, and at the same time, there was a PR, well, let's say just an information campaign going on at the same time. I think they even created a deep fake of the governor there, giving instructions for people to evacuate, or I don't know exactly what they had him say, but it just added to the confusion. But that seems to be past, it's settled down, and it looks like that, now that well, they're just pounding him from the air because they have this complete air superiority, and they're bringing in all the forces, and they're gonna crush them. But it may take a while to get some of them out of those border villages.
Right. So do you think this was okayed by the U.S., the West? I mean, I feel like anything that Ukraine does, the U.S. is there,
Well, yeah.
guiding
Well,
them, listening to
it's hard
them.
to
Sure, they
believe
use some
that.
intelligence,
Yeah,
satellite
right.
information. I mean,
Yeah, it's hard to believe that, right? That the U.S. and the MI6 wasn't involved at some level. It's very hard to believe. And then it's also interesting that they again they are using U.S. weapons to go into pre-1990, and before it was very kind of they had set a very limited scope, for the use of U.S. weapons in that territory. If you remember, you could use certain weapons, up to HIMARS, simply to prevent, actually it was the Kharkov region to weaken any sort of offensive or attack by the Russians. But this is clearly offensive, and it's it's over Sumy and Kursk. They're in the Kursk region right now. So it doesn't seem to conform to the conditions that they had laid down. And then, of course, what are the targets? Again, they clearly were deliberately attacking civilians. But the U.S. said that they were okay with this. This was somehow, warranted as somehow a defensive measure. But I don't see how it is. It just makes sense to me.
wait. The U.S. said they were okay.
Yeah,
They were
right.
okay
I
with
think
Ukraine killing the civilians in Kursk.
well, no. They didn't say that. They pretend they don't know anything about civilians. But they were okay with this action, which clearly is targeting civilians. But they're just going to pretend that didn't happen, right?
Hmm.
They're not going to say outright, "Oh, we're okay with them targeting civilians." But they say they're fine with this, with this incursion. But this incursion, part of it is clearly, involved targeting civilians.
This Ukraine war has exposed a lot of things. It exposed the weakness of our military equipment, going up against these Russian defenses. It hasn't shaped up the way we expect it to be. But the other thing that's actually even more astonishing to me is just how ineffective our military leadership and strategies are. it's amazing that we are there basically conducting this war in Ukraine, and we're so awful at it. We telegraph everything we do, like with this offensive that happened last year. Like, okay, this is what we're going to do, guys. We're going right here. We're telegraphing it to the Russians, and they did it. Just ran right across all the minefields, right into all of the dragon's teeth or whatever. Never even reached the main defensive line. And
Right.
then everything we've seen them do now, it seems like they care about what can we do that would make a good PR stunt for to get this more money, this bill passed through next week. There's no long-term strategy, it seems like, at all. I mean, who's in charge? Who's calling the shots? It's surely these people should be fired. Like, if you do want to support the Kiev regime and the Kiev cause, do you think there would be somebody that's a little bit more competent, that will be a little bit
Hmm.
more patient and could, like, okay, look, we need to conserve our troops, we need to draw them back. Let's don't tell the enemy what we're doing, because we're constantly telling them what we're going to do. Instead, we'll hide back here. And, there's just some basic common sense strategy that doesn't seem like we want to implement at all. Why is that? Why? Well, it's almost like
Well,
surely it's not intentional, right? The U.S. is not trying to sabotage Ukraine.
no,
It almost
no,
feels like it, that they're giving them
right,
such terrible advice.
right, right.
It's
Well, yeah, certainly. Like I think last year in the defensive, they clearly, that is to say, the U.S., the collective West, clearly had fallen for its own propaganda, right? And they seem to really believe that the Russians were, on the verge of collapse, and that if we punched them hard, or rather not we, but rather the Ukrainians punched them hard with all our, with all our the equipment that we provided them, that the Russians would just collapse like a house of cards. And they seem to really have believed that. Apparently, I mean, there were even Ukrainian soldiers that reported that that was part of their training. They were told that the Russians have low morale, and they're probably going to run when you first appear. And I think they really believed it. I mean, that's a huge intelligence failure. It's they let wishful thinking get in the way of any honest assessment. So that's part of it. And then now I think, truth be told, at least in the United States, they don't really, everything's about the election, right, from here to November. And so they are focused on the short term, and they're not thinking strategically. They're not thinking about the long-term costs of an operation like this one right now. If they can get some PR points, it'll help them. But interestingly, this makes you wonder if how much the U.S. was really behind it, and maybe, this was mainly a Ukrainian affair, because this I don't know really what's going on now, but in the initial stages, like the first 24 hours or so, got very little coverage in the West. It was barely mentioned, like in British media, and I think it had very little mention in the U.S. too. All the focus was on the Middle East. So you would think if this was something that they had planned closely with Kiev, that they would have coordinated it with some sort of PR offensive at this end, but it didn't happen. So that makes me think that maybe they had to be aware of it, but maybe really it was Kiev was the prime mover here. This was something they want to do, and maybe you know I don't think there's any way they could have done this without the foreknowledge of, for example, the UK and the US. Maybe the UK and the US weren't really too enthusiastic about it. I mean, Kiev does have some
So is
autonomy,
that
as yeah,
meaning
right.
that Ukraine is right? So Ukraine is going maybe half rogue, and it might be moving more and more in that direction. I mean, that's also
Yeah,
something to be kind of worried about. Is we've pumped this country with tons of weaponry and billions of dollars, and it's going around half
yeah,
cocked as a rogue terrorist
right,
state.
right.
Um,
Well, there was that
that's not good.
interesting,
You
yeah,
don't want that. Nobody wants that in Europe. Your next door neighbor.
yeah. Well, that's always been
Go
true. I
ahead.
mean, there was that incident, I guess it was a couple months ago that the Russian defense minister, I guess, Belousov, um, called our Secretary of Defense, right? And at the time there was a lot of head scratching about that because that happens very rarely. It's actually when there's communication, it's usually our guy that calls their guy. But this time it was the other way around. Then it got leaked that it was okay. There was something the Russians had got wind of some really drastic terrorist operation being planned by the Ukrainians, and they say, "Hey, we know about this. You tell them to knock it off." And do you know about it? And in any case, let them know, don't do it. And apparently, we did tell them to knock it off. What it was, I mean, later there was a more recent leak, or at least a news report. It was a planned assassination. They were going to assassinate Putin and I think the defense minister at some sort of parade or some kind of public event. Or they were going to attempt it. We don't know that we pull it off. But that's uh, it's interesting. I think, it suggests if these reports are true that the U.S. didn't know everything, that they're doing, and when they found about it, found out about it, they said no. There are limits. So in this case, it's hard to believe because this is
Mm.
much, when you're talking about an assassination, there may be just a few individuals. You could keep that secret. This had to be a larger operation. Again, my feeling is because we didn't really see it coordinated with a big, massive media blitz here, that it wasn't something that we cooked up, but something that the Kiev regime cooked up, and that possibly, like, MI6 helped them out with it, but it wasn't something that we were too enthusiastic about because we could see the downside of it.
It's so shameful. It makes me up, makes me mad to be an American, upset to be an American
Hmm.
that we are supporting both Ukraine and Israel, which are essentially becoming terrorist states that are actively open about assassinating, their opponents, engaging in
Killing
terrorist attacks,
civilians.
deliberately targeting civilians, and we're
Sure.
right killing civilians. I mean, in Israel, it's a
Yeah,
genocide, and we're
right.
backing it, and we're supposed to be the most powerful country in the world, but we don't have the ability to meet these people on the field and fight them, a real war honorably. We have to engage in terrorist activities and support terrorist acts and support terrorist regimes, and somehow we try to keep the moral high ground. I just don't understand how we can do that much longer. The world has turned their backs against us, and I have too. I've turned my back against the United States. I love my country. I hate my government. What it's done, like it's so shameful that this is what we do. We support terrorism. We are. There's no if, ands, or buts around that. I think. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, clearly we do. I mean, again, you have to describe much of what Kiev
So
does
we're a
as
terrorist.
terrorism.
We are the
Now,
biggest.
we deny, like, this has happened many times because, um, the Kiev regime has been committing terrorist acts on Russian soil since early in the war. They've assassinated, of course, journalists and earlier, and then assassinated many, many politicians in eastern Ukraine too. Um, we've known about that, but earlier there were leaks that would occasionally appear in the New York Times as saying that, oh, the CIA is upset that Kiev did this or did that. So there's a certain amount of wringing of hands and an effort to maintain some sort of separation. But it's just sort of like Israel. We do the same thing with Israel. Of course, I mean the war crimes that Israel is committing are much, much worse. They're just orders of magnitude greater than what Kiev's doing. I mean, what Kiev's doing is
Mhm.
serious, clearly is terrorism, um, completely unjustified, but it's just on a much greater scale, of course, in Israel. But we do the same thing where we pretend like, oh, we're concerned about the civilians. We've talked to them and we're trying to, but in both cases, look, if you wanted it to stop, you could make it stop, right? You could end the war in Gaza rather quickly. And we could end the war in Ukraine too, or we could make them at least change their policy. If we're going to support the proxy war, we can say, okay, but you cannot do this, or you're not going to get another, missile from us. And that would be it. They would just have to listen to us. But clearly, we're not saying that. So those expressions of concern, that's just show. I think it clearly is. They know what's going on. Either they support it, or they support the terrorism, or they don't care about the terrorism. If they wanted it to stop, they could make it stop.
Okay. So right now, what's going on in Kursk? Are there still thousands of Ukrainian soldiers that are holding on to several square kilometers of land? I mean, what's the goal?
Yeah,
They did their little
right,
PR stunt. It seems like it's already died down. And now what they're just
right,
going to be, all those fighters will probably, majority of them will be killed, and Ukraine will be weaker
right.
than ever. And Russia is going to be even more upset and have more resolve to defeat the
Yeah,
Kiev regime even more quickly
right.
and maybe even more heavy handedly now. Is that
Um,
basically what's good
well,
job? Is that
yeah,
what happened?
yeah. Well, in the long run, in the short run, the battle isn't over there. Yeah, there are maybe 1,000, 2,000 on Russian soil, and they've dug in again in these settlements that are close to the border. And then when you dig in, you get into the basements, you dig trenches or whatever. You know what happens. It can become a real long and bloody fight. We've seen those kind of fights, all through the Donbass. So there's a chance. And then there's also, I mean, the fighting remains intense there, and there are at least, yeah, I see conflicting reports, but there seem to be more Ukrainian forces that they're perhaps going to try to funnel in there. Now, they may not be able to do it at this point because, again, it looks like the Russians are forming a solid line, but there may be an effort to break through again in that area. So we'll see. It could go, the battle could go on for a little while. It could go
Okay.
on for weeks, even potentially. Now, one thing to remember is that even an army that is losing overall and clearly is eventually going to lose can have successful counterattacks, at least in the short run. I mean, like Germany after the Battle of Kursk, again, that's kind of, as some people pointed out, there was a German politician that said we supported sending our tanks to Kursk. The world's largest tank battle was fought in Kursk, and the Germans lost. And that was really kind of the beginning of the end for the German army in World War II. But from that point on, it was clear where things were headed. But the Germans, they counterattacked again and again. Occasionally, they would succeed because you can always concentrate forces in some point on the line and break through again. But
The Battle of
the
the
others,
Bulge.
yeah, the battle, that's the best example, that the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive. And so they
Hmm.
actually, struck rather deep into territory that had been held by the Allies there. And it scared a lot of people. But in the end, it actually just hastened the demise of the Nazi regime, because they expended. Yeah, they had a couple of days of where where they were on top in that one region, and they could they, they achieved a victory in the short run, but it was at the expense of you know, uh, it was at great cost. They lost a lot of men, which they couldn't afford to lose. They lost a lot of equipment. They used up a lot of fuel, and they just accelerated the downfall of the German army. And I think this is true on a much, on a smaller scale. But you can expect to see other things like this. I mean, it may be another. I don't know how long the Ukrainian army is going to last. Maybe it'll be another year. 6 months, a year, 2 years. I don't know. I always, if we keep on pouring the weapons in there, I tend to think it can't really be much more than a year. But in that time, they will be able to occasionally pull off successful counterattacks. Again, they can always, at a certain point in the line, it's a very long line. We're talking about like 1,000-mile front here. You can always find a point, where that's
Hmm.
lightly defended and you can concentrate your forces and break through. But the big question is, can you hold it? Can you continue to exploit that? Can you move forward and build from that? And I don't think they have the capacity to do that.
Back in World War II, when Germany was on the ropes, were they doing press gangs like what we're seeing in Ukraine, where they're rounding people up on the street and forcing them to the front? Because
You
that
know
seems
what?
to be
Yeah,
me the a real indicator that this is
right.
over. If you have to really force people, grab them off the street, and throw them up there that don't want to
Yeah,
fight, the
right,
war is over, in my opinion.
right.
But I don't remember hearing
I
stories about
no,
that in World War
I'm
II. Do you know
sure
if
that
that
it would.
happened?
I don't think it did. You know, correct me if I'm wrong, or I don't think it did. I would have. I think you would. I read several histories of that war, and you've seen all kinds of newsreels, but never did I hear anything like. I think actually, quite remarkably, the support for the government was strong until really the very end. Actually, it seems stronger than it is in Ukraine now, much stronger. I mean, there's obviously a lot of people who do not want to fight and are doing whatever they can. I mean, those stories of people trying to escape are just, they're daily. Like just recently, there was a whole, I think it was a refrigerated truck that was stuffed crammed full of like 40 guys. They were trying to get across the border into Moldova, I believe it was, and they were caught. They're just doing whatever they can to get out of there. And I actually don't think it was like that in Germany, even in the last months.
Right, everybody's hiding, running, trying to get out. It's terrifying. If you're a young man, somebody my age living in Ukraine, my God, that's got to be just so horrifying. You just
Yeah, I
got
would
to
do
hide in
whatever
your
I could get out of
basement
there.
and or
Right,
try to pay somebody 10,000 euros to try to
right.
get out of the country, but then you might get caught. Um, yeah, has there been any historical example that's similar to this in the past 100 years or so, where we've had to force people to fight like this, where you have to round them up and without very little training, they're just
Yeah,
cannon fodder. That's what's so
right.
sick about this. Like
Yeah,
what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, and that is horrific. I can't think of anything more terrible than that.
yeah,
But
right.
in a way, it's similar to just say, okay, they're soldiers, but they're soldiers against their will. They're essentially civilians that are being put in a uniform, get very little training, and get sent to the front. And from my understanding, this Kursk incursion, this was done with basically the last sort of real battalion that is really gung ho, that loves killing Russians, hate Russians, because they know they can't send those other people because they don't want to fight. They all their job is to just sort of sit there and hold these positions and slowly die to try to slow the advance
Right,
of the Russians. They're
right.
not expecting them to carry out any offensive because
Yeah,
they don't want to fight. They don't want to be there.
right,
And you sent your basically only offensive capability troop into Kursk, and now they're going to all die or be captured there because they're not. Let's be honest, they're not going back. The Russia's going to cut off the rear end. They might dig in and cause some damage, kill some people, some intense fighting for a couple of weeks, but it's over. And then now you're
yeah,
left with just the Ukrainian army is built up of now forced conscription of people that don't want to fight. For me, that's horrific. That's like a
yeah,
genocide with extra steps. You saying like, oh, we're going through and we'll put you in uniform, and now you can get killed for our
hmm,
cause.
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
it's
No, it is
awful.
horrifying, right? No,
I
I really feel for those
has there
people. I think about it.
has
Yeah,
there ever
no, I can't.
been anything like this before?
Like the term press
Where
gang
you
is something that I've always associated with, like Great Britain in the 18th century or something. People got press ganged. It happened. Like, you're hanging around the docks, and then there's this, a group of thugs authorized by the crown, would simply grab you and put you on a ship, and you would be sent off. I really can't. There must be something. There must be some war, in recent history where the press gangs were active, but I can't think of it. I really can't. It's
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
certainly not
Yeah, I mean
yeah,
that's the only thing
not
I
World
can
War
think of as
II or
well was the old days. Yeah, you
right,
don't want to be hanging around the docks in the 18th century. Just stay
right,
clear of those because
right.
they come in and that's right. That's the only thing that I could think of too was the old time press gangs or getting shanghaied.
Uh-huh.
Just stay clear of the docks during those times. But nothing like this. This is in any war that I've followed or paid attention to in the past 150 years. I've
Yeah,
never heard of
yeah. There must be some
forcing
exception, but I
people,
I
grabbing them
think
out of their homes.
right. If it's an exception, it must be very small because it was something otherwise. I think.
Yeah, it's just so shameful that the United States is behind both of these. We're
Yeah,
supporting this. Lindsey Graham going there and saying, you got to find more men. You got to find more
yeah.
men to send up there and die
Right, right,
for.
right. Well,
Well,
they're
we
they're
don't even know what is the objective now anymore. Can we explain what is Ukraine hoping to do? they're
Well,
obviously not going to get those the
yeah,
regions that Russia
yeah,
controls now. So what is the objective? Just to last until the election? Who's in charge?
okay.
Is it the U.S. saying you have to keep on fighting? Who? Sorry,
Right.
there's
Well, I
a
think,
lot going on there, but
yeah, yeah. Well, I think yeah, clearly well, it's not really the Biden administration. It's maybe it's the Biden administration because the Democratic Party, wants to keep this going. I think that's at least until November, keep things looking good. I think that's clear. But then you hear, other, Pentagon officials and European leaders saying, well, what we have to do is give the Ukrainians a better negotiating position. So they're admitting, often they don't say it outright. Sometimes they do, but usually they're admitting that Ukraine can't possibly recover those territories. Certainly not Crimea or the pre 20. But they think maybe they through negotiations, if Ukraine has some successes, makes it clear to Russia. This is the theory anyway, that it's going to cost you an awful lot. You're not going to be able to get the territories you think you can get. So let's sit down at the negotiating table and achieve some kind of compromise now. Um, I think that's actually still it's delusional. It's just not the way things are going. Russia understands Russia's growing stronger, Ukraine's growing weaker, and you can pull off this occasional counterattack kind of stunt, but it's not going to change the trajectory of the war. As this stunt's going on in an area where there aren't any real, military installations, where no real damage is being done to the Russian army or to Russia's military capabilities. Russia continues to punch through, again, in the Ocheredno area and also Toretsk, where then those are the important places, and everybody really knows that that's where the future of the war is being decided. And so, yeah, I don't know what they're thinking, but again, it's just these people are not thinking very rationally. I think they simply cannot come to terms with the reality. I mean, they're kind of slowly, maybe, slowly waking up to it, but they can't simply say, "Oh, hey, we're just going to lose this. Okay, we screwed up. We miscalculated. We grossly underestimated the the resolve and the capabilities of the Russians. We overestimated our own capabilities. They can't do that right now. They can't really look at themselves in the mirror honestly. So there's maybe they're kind of to switch metaphors. Again, they're like the super tanker that's starting to turn. You got to turn 180, but they're turning like 3 degrees, and then eventually. But it's just too late. I mean, they're talking about things that maybe could have meant something 2 years ago, but they're just way behind. And the Russians continue to change the reality on the ground.